freelance and been working with SharePoint specifically for about 4 years now. Recently did the SharePoint Elite training, one of the first people to go through that and pass the 2007 version for the developer training. This is a little bit about me. I obviously don't have time to meet all you guys and see where you're at, but I'm going to make a few assumptions about where you guys are coming from at the moment. This is a 300 level session, so because of the breadth of stuff that we need to cover for WCM, I'm going to use that and sort of assume that most of you guys are sort of either developers or architects, and that you've already kind of got a pretty good level of experience using 2007. So specifically, I'm going to assume that you've already kind of gone through that process of designing and implementing, deploying, and maintaining a MOS public web. So we're going to be kind of moving from that and then looking at some of the delta to see what's going to change moving into 2010. So like I said, it is, we've only got an hour this year, so we're going to sort of move through a bunch of different stuff. We're not going to have time to do any kind of deep dives on any particular element, but if there's something that sort of piques your interest, then come and see me afterwards and we can chat, have a bit of a chat through it. So in terms of what we're covering, firstly we're going to go through and look at web content management. Then we're going to look at some new features in SharePoint 2010, and then we're going to go through the application lifecycle. And what I mean by that is, firstly, we're going to go through and look at some of the context. So web content management, what are we talking about? What kinds of capabilities are we referring to? And then we're going to look at the new features in SharePoint 2010 and see kind of where that fits in. So where does that fit into the common capabilities? And then I thought what I'd do is I'd go through a bit of a scenario. So I could go up and just throw a couple of random demos around, but what I've done is I've come up with a bit of scenario, and we're going to look at that kind of full application lifecycle and see where those changes are actually going to affect the process that you're familiar with. So web content management. So what is it? I mean, basically, it's just website authoring for non-technical people, okay? And there is a bunch of different options out there, both in the Microsoft world, as well as the world of open source, dirty, long-haired hippies. But aside from all of these different options that we've got, there's a bunch of different features, but there are some common attributes. And so that's what we're going to look at now. Just wait for my slide should build up artistically. There we go. So I'm going to look at these 6 different attributes, okay? So we're going to look at content, presentation, aggregation, extensibility, deployment, and tools. Click that thing. There we go. And so basically we're going to just look at WCM solutions and build it up, so show where we come from, okay? So if we go back, we're going to start WSS, build on top of ASP.NET, and we're going to analyze each of these different attributes and what that gave us, okay? So from the content perspective, firstly we've got content types. Now, content types are a fundamental building block of WCM solution or SharePoint solutions in general. And we've also got the creation of the sort of SP object hierarchy. So we've got SP site, SP web, SP list, list field value, all that kind of stuff. And so we've got that on the sort of, on one hand we've got the metadata side of our taxonomy, and the other side we've got the structural hierarchy side of our taxonomy. Now that's quite important. So we'll sort of be coming back to that a little bit. But that's where it comes from. So it comes from WSS. We've also got things around, we've got our versioning, we've got content approval, all that kind of stuff. Within the presentation layer, so what the presentation attribute is really referring to is, once we've got our content, how do we present it? How do we brand it? How do we make it look awesome? Okay, and within WSS, the sort of the coarse-grained option that we've got is the master page. Okay, it comes from ASP.NET, and it allows us to apply a broad level of branding to pages within the site. So very high level. It doesn't give you much control over each individual content page, but that's the option that you've got for your branding. You've also got themes. Maybe not so much useful in a sort of a public-facing web content management scenario, but they're another option for you to style up the content that you've got using a sort of SharePoint-specific prepackaged CSS and resources component. Within the aggregation attribute here, really what we're talking about is we're saying we've got our content, that has metadata, it has a structure, when you browse to that content, we've got a way of presenting it. Aggregation is saying, look, we want to surface this stuff. We want to show it in a way that makes sense to users. And so we've got, navigation as an example of aggregation. We're relying on the structural, hierarchical side of our taxonomy to surface content. But we've also got a query for content that meets a certain metadata query. Okay, so the sort of the way that we've got to do that through WSS is using data view web part. You can put that in using SharePoint Designer, hook it up to a particular area of the hierarchy, and then specify a query based on metadata. And of course, you can do that behind the scenes using the object model SP query as well. Within the extensibility attribute, what we're talking about is we're saying that there's all this out-of-the-box stuff that we've got, all these hooks. What are the common things that we're going to extend to be able to make our WSM solutions work in practice? Okay, and field controls. So field controls are right back there in WSS. And what a field control is essentially a component or a control that ties the user interface into a particular attribute in that content, so that it takes care of all the plumbing between, kind of wiring up the updates and that kind of stuff, and you can focus on just the styling of that as well. And you've also got other things there around your form components, allowing you to style up different parts of the list views and that kind of thing. So yes, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff there, right? But those are just kind of a couple of the highlights that are probably going to be used, a lot of the time. From the deployment perspective, what we're looking at, this is where WSPs come in. Okay, so basically the SharePoint deployment package that you're going to use to deploy your site. Before that, in ASP.NET, you'd have your virtual directory, web config, all that kind of stuff. So with WSS, you get this framework for deploying that in a sort of really nice managed way. Of course, you also get STS-ADM, which comes through the WSS there as well. And tools, not a whole lot to say about that, but we've got the VisiWiz, the sort of Visual Studio extensions for WSS that were there in 2007, as well as SharePoint Designer, which I'm sure most of you have had experience with. Some of you may have had really great experience with it. Yeah. So that's where we've come from in WSS. Now we're going to move on. We're going to say, well, what did MOS do? What did that actually bring us? And from the content perspective, we're building on top of the content, the taxonomy that we've got. We've now got the ability to do publishing. So publishing is essentially, kind of a ramped up version of the content approval, version control, all kind of put in there into the versioning. You can put schedules on it. You've got this ability to create schedules so that content's going to be, thrown out to the public, at a certain point in time. So that's all where that kind of fits in this attribute, in the content attribute. In terms of styling that or displaying that using your branding, you've got another level. So, in WSS we've got the master page, whereas now in MOS we've got page layouts. And, I'm sure you guys are pretty familiar with these. It basically just allows you to create another layer. So between your coarse-grained, your master page and then the individual content page, you've now got the ability to style that up. And you can use, field controls and web part zones and all that kind of stuff. Within the aggregation layer, aggregation attribute, we've got the content query web part. Now, this is a really awesome tool that we could use in 2007. And basically what that allowed us to do is surface up content, aggregate content throughout the site, and display it based on certain criteria. Okay. There was a couple of things about the content query web part that meant that in real-world usage you sort of run into a few issues of that. And I think that led to a lot of people kind of building their own, custom controls or subclass in the content query web part to add extra features, a little bit more kind of dynamism into it and extensibility from the display point of view. But, it was there as an awesome option that you had available. Within the extensibility, basically more field controls, right? There's a whole bunch of other stuff that you could use, but from a straight web content management perspective, now we've got publishing page image, we've got publishing page HTML, we've got summary links, all this other cool stuff, and that's come through the MOS. And for our deployment attribute, we've got content deployment. Okay, so it's another one that I'm sure a few guys have had experience with. Again, like maybe a few of you had some possibly not so great experience with it. But it was built on top of the import-export APIs that were in WSS, and it basically provides a whole bunch of the sort of the plumbing and the sort of the interface in that to be able to support taking a source site and deploying that across into a destination site. Okay. Cool. So that's where we've come from. Okay. So building it up, we've looked at WSM, we've looked at some common attributes of WSM systems, and we've looked at the sort of a little bit of the history of how that's sort of developed so far. So now we're going to have a look at what has changed in 2010, or what's been enhanced in 2010. So from the content attribute, within WSS, this is where we defined our taxonomy in terms of metadata and in terms of structure, or hierarchical structure. And one of the issues is that those two things were quite separate. They didn't really overlap too much. If you're going to use metadata, you couldn't really create hierarchical metadata, and it was defined within a single site. Now, when it goes to SharePoint 2010, basically what we're seeing is a real combination of these two different things, from the metadata perspective and from the structural hierarchy perspective. So in 2007, we'd end up making these trade-offs around, how we were going to structure the site, how we're going to design our site, because we wanted hierarchy, and that a lot of the time meant that we're going to have to, structure the site using a taxonomy that depends just on the structural hierarchy, and we weren't able to maybe use some of the metadata attributes. Okay, that means that basically, for a particular piece of content, it would have one parent if you were going to go for that. Whereas for the metadata side, you could have, it could have multiple metadata parents, essentially. You could roll it up to multiple places, but at the end of that, still, there was only a single level of hierarchy. Now, within 2010, because these two things are coming together, suddenly what we've got is we've got metadata that is hierarchical. Okay, so we're using the managed metadata service. We can create this rich kind of hierarchical taxonomy that doesn't depend on the structure. And when you start thinking about that, it just gives you some really great options. It starts giving you a lot more flexibility when it comes to your IA, and it's really going to change some of the reasons why traditionally we've put things in a particular, you create a particular web for a particular kind of content. Maybe now you might start using that managed metadata service to structure that a little bit. Another sort of example of the way that our metadata and our structural hierarchy is sort of coming together is through the use of our enterprise content types. Okay, so we can use a content type hub and basically define our content types in one place. Okay, and that's what we would have been able to do in 2007. But now what we can do is we can also push that out beyond the boundaries of the site collection through to other site collections. So again, we're seeing some of the real advantages that come from the hierarchy and the advantages that come from the metadata, and we're getting both of those advantages now in 2010. And it is, it's a concept, I know, kind of philosophical, but it's in terms of just the IA, in terms of your design, in terms of the sort of solutions you're going to be able to build. I think it's absolutely massive. We've also seen within 2010, within this content attribute again, we've seen a little bit of a move from the 2007 model with authoring and content and kind of ownership. It was really around, this is my content author, and my content author owns the content, essentially, right? Whereas now we're going to a more social model, okay? So now we're starting to see that sort of a little bit of a mindset shift. Now we're saying that, yeah, content authors, they create the content, but we're also engaging people to be able to respond to that as well, okay? So we're throwing that open. We're saying, look, we want to encourage that that social, the community, the social authoring of our content as well. Now, within a web content management scenario, unfortunately, it's not going to meet, the out-of-the-box social components aren't going to meet all of your requirements, all of your different scenarios. They sort of generally depend on, having an authenticated user to sort of manage a lot of that sort of social content. So it's not something that you're just going to be able to throw out there on the public web, with anonymous users. But it is something, in some situations with web content management systems, you are going to be able to take advantage of that out-of-the-box components. But even if you aren't able to, you can still sort of see that, SharePoint 2010 is really moving towards more of that model at least. From the presentation attribute, we're seeing a little bit around that. So that first thing there is around the wiki. Okay, so obviously we've had wikis for ages, right? But now we've got this enterprise wiki, and what that means is that now we've got another option, essentially. Okay, so with our page layouts in 2007, if you wanted to brand up the site, you wanted to create a new kind of page, you might need to create a new page layout to have a particular kind of design layout for that. But of course, the good thing about using that is that then you were going to have content approval and then publishing and all that kind of stuff based on your content pages. Now, within 2010, now we have the ability to create these wiki pages using the Enterprise Wiki, and it basically gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of what the design is going to look like. So it's probably not the kind of thing, for a public web web content management scenario, it's not the kind of thing that's going to be great for everybody. But if your solution is depending on a couple of people who have got really good design skills, and they're kind of going to be owning some of that design for that, it's another option that you could use. You can use, instead of having them to go through and create a whole new page layout for a particular kind of content, they could potentially use one of these page layouts, the enterprise wiki pages, to be able to style up some content that's specific to something without going through that overhead. While at the same time you've still got your publishing. So it's sort of another option to be aware of. Another thing from the presentation layer is that within 2007, when you wanted to style something out, a lot of the time people would be using web parts. Cool. A lot of different ways to do web parts. So in 2007, there's options. Maybe you wanted to use XSLT. Maybe you wanted to do a server control. Maybe you wanted to use a smart part or something like that. There's a bunch of different options. Now, within 2010, Microsoft has kind of simplified it a little bit for us, and they've said, look, here's a visual web part. It kind of has all these cool things about it already. You don't have to really do that much. It's right there. So again, there are other options, but just within that presentation attribute, having that visual web part there, it just means that it's kind of a no-brainer. You can just kind of, if you need to use a web part, you need to be able to control how it's going to look from a branding perspective. You can go and use that. Now, the content query web part, from the aggregation attribute, there's a couple of things. The content query web part in 2007 was awesome, okay? Especially on paper, it was awesome. But then when you go to use it, I'm sure some of you guys had sort of hit a few limitations with it. Particularly when it comes to actually using this thing, maintaining it, and creating it sort of in a way that was specific to certain kinds of content. Now, the challenges, two of the main challenges that I kind of found using the content query web part in 2007 is that, firstly, when you're trying to aggregate content, you had to choose between either putting it on a web part zone and then individually placing this content query web part into a web part zone per page and setting it up to aggregate the content that's relevant for that particular page. Or you'd have to put it on the page layout. And if you put it on the page layout, you can't really make it specific to each individual page. So if you put it on the page layout and you said, bring me back all of the content that is related to this tag, it's going to bring that all back for every single page. So that was one of the first problems that I kind of had with it. And the second problem that I had with it was that, especially from a maintainability perspective, sometimes you'd want to use this content query web part, you'd wire it all up, you'd get your content back, and then you go to display it, and the field that you wanted to render just wasn't there, okay? And so then you'd have to go through this rigmarole, and you'd have to go through and export the XML and camel view fields, find the internal name, biff it in, get it back in, and eventually your field turns up. And it was just a hassle, right? It's just a bit of a pain. So those are two of the things that kind of really frustrated me, about the content query web part in 2007. But fortunately, 2010 version has solved both of those issues. Okay, there's probably maybe some other things that other issues that it has, but those two issues mean that it is now a lot more suitable. Okay, so the way that it solves the first one in terms of the dynamic content generation. Now what you can do is within the filters of your content query web part, you can basically say, instead of bringing me back everything that is tagged with tag X, now what you can do is you can say, bring me back all the content that is tagged with this page field value that I've got on the current page. Okay? And the other way you can do it is you can say, bring back all the content that has a tag field value that's been passed through in the query string. So straight away, that means that we can create a content query web part, we can put it on our page layout, we can wire it up to a site column that's on the same page layout, or we can wire it up to either that or a query string parameter, and suddenly we've got you browse to these different pages based on the page layout, and it's showing you this relevant content for all these with very little work. So one of the great things is that it also works with all the out-of-the-box field types, including the managed metadata service. So there's some really cool ways that you can kind of roll up content with in a really sort of productive way. The way that it solves the other one, so this is around selecting the fields that get brought back to be able to display those. Now, basically what's happened is the content query web part in 2010 has introduced a layer of abstraction between the query and between the XSLT that renders each individual item. And so what this is called, it's referred to as a slot, okay? And so what that allows you to do is you say that the XSLT is asking for something to put in the title field, okay? Just from the XSLT perspective. And then the content query web part, you can say, look, when it asks for the title field, use this field. And you might use, the kind of the abstract or the description or the name or whatever you're going to use. And you can just wire that up within the content query web part properties as well. Again, so these two things mean that straight away, those kind of, probably 70% of the cases why people were kind of replacing these content query parts now maybe aren't so much of an issue. So definitely something to be aware of with that. From the extensibility side, we've seen that, so actually it kind of goes back to a little bit to the content attribute. Okay, content attribute, where I was talking a little bit about the taxonomy being split between our sort of our metadata and our structure. Now, within the extensibility, we now have the BCS, okay, which is kind of like the BDC on steroids. Okay, read-write BDC, available from the lowest level SharePoint Foundation. Now, one of the cool things that means from a web content perspective is that now you can have content in your site that doesn't actually live in your site. That kind of sounds, a little bit circular there, but what that means is that, a lot of the time in 2007 when you were trying to use content deployment, okay, you'd have your source site, and you'd have your destination site. Destination site needs to be, read-only because you can't go around editing stuff on that. And as soon as you want something, social, you might want comments on a page, you might want, people to be able to submit, contact us going to a list or whatever you want. As soon as you start doing that, it just starts adding complexity. And you need to start thinking about how you're actually going to get that content and put it somewhere else that's not going to kind of disrupt that read-only destination site. Now, with the BCS, what we can do is we can create external lists that sit within the source and the destination site, but they actually maintain that content completely outside of the site collection. It could be anywhere. It could be in a database. It could be over a web service or whatever. But it just means that now we can program on top of that using, you've got your SharePoint developers who are already familiar with, doing SB queries and, putting together a web part, that kind of thing. Well, they just do the same thing as they've always done. But at another level, we can make sure we know where that content is going, and it's not going to disrupt us from a content deployment perspective. So it's definitely something to just sort of be aware of. And the other thing is, the sandbox. Not really going to go into it a whole heap here, but it definitely gives you the ability, potentially for infrastructure people, I suppose, to be able to lock down what's going on in their environment a little bit better. From a web content management perspective, there's a bunch of stuff that does work within the sandbox, and I'll be sort of touching on a few things. But the main thing you need to be aware of is that you do have that option. And sort of from the deployment attribute, okay, so I've talked a little bit about content deployment from a 2007 perspective. Content deployment is it's on paper, right, it's perfect for, for public web. Unfortunately, there were a number of issues in 2007 to the point where, certainly for us, we sort of started recommending against using content deployment in a lot of scenarios just because of the overhead, of the hassle that it was causing. Now, if you haven't tried to use it, then you might be saying, what are you going on about? But if you have, then I'm pretty confident that you know what I'm saying. Now, one of the things about content deployment in 2007 that had the potential to make things a little bit complex is that when you actually running that content deployment job, so content deployment, just if you're not familiar with it, basically what it allows you to do is at a scheduled time to package up any changes to a source site and then deploy them across to another site collection and import those. And that could be on a different farm, could be in the same farm. There's a whole bunch of flexibility around the way you configure that, but that's basically what it does. In 2007, when the content deployment job actually started running, basically what it would do is it would have a task on the source site, and it would just start pulling stuff out and packaging it, okay? So it's just pulling out this page, pulling out this list item, finding some dependencies, resolving some stuff, packaging it up. Finally, it would package that thing out, send it across, and then import it, and then something would die because, if you look at the error logs, you wouldn't have a lot of idea why it died, but something's died. Now, one of the cool things about content deployment in 2010, especially if you're using actually only if you're using SQL Enterprise, so that kind of cuts that out. But if you are using SQL Enterprise, what it allows you to do is that when that content deployment job actually starts, what it does is it relies on a point-in-time SQL snapshot. So it just takes a snapshot, and from that point, it packages up content directly from SQL using that point-in-time snapshot. So, from 2007, if you were actually running that process and you had other people authoring on the site at the same time, you could end up with things that are being packaged that are actually out of sync. So you've got something that's a different version from something else. You'd get some crazy stuff happening. That's not going to happen anymore, okay, if you're using SQL Enterprise. That snapshot is going to be used to create that whole deployment package, which is then going to be shipped across to the destination. And, yeah, so there's basically content deployment. The main thing I kind of want to get across is that Don't be too cynical about it if you're a little bit cynical about it already. At least give it another look. Some good things have happened. And moving on to the tools attribute, a couple of things that have really been increased. I mean, two of things, right? Visual Studio, the tools that are built into Visual Studio for SharePoint development now are a whole lot better than, VisiWiz. Okay, so to the point that, we didn't really use the Visual Studio extensions for WSS. We tried to use them, all the different versions. Every time they'd come out, we'd try and use them, but they just had a number of issues, right? So we'd go to things like WSP Builder and STS Dev and SP Source and all these things. Now, the actual ones that build into the Visual Studio are a lot better. Okay, they're not perfect, but they are a lot better. And it's got support for a whole bunch of the common kinds of things that you'd want to be able to deploy and package. So Visual Studio, awesome, right? SharePoint Designer is a whole lot better as well. And that's the other sort of the main tool that you can be using for SharePoint sites. It doesn't crash as much, which is great. But it's also, it takes a little bit of time to get used to the interface, but it is really good. Like I found that, if you're working with it, it's a lot better than 2007. I don't think we need to dwell on that too much. It kind of makes me a bit depressed thinking about SharePoint Designer. But anyway, developer dashboard. That's the other great thing to sort of be aware of. Okay, so now if you're not familiar with it, basically the developer dashboard allows you to turn it on, and then at that point, when you render a page, you go to a page, and it'll print out like this massive stack trace of everything that's going on behind the scenes. So that's going to include all the method calls that happen through the page lifecycle, all the controls, and it'll tell you how much time is actually being spent on each different part. And you can use that to really, in your solution scenario, you can go through, if your page is loading a bit slow, what's the guts? Do you need to go through and increase some sort of caching policy, or is it just one of your developers has written a dodgy web part? At least this gives you a really simple way of working that out. Now, developer dashboard, it's not turned on by default, but you can turn that on. Basically, you can either do one line in STS-ADM or sort of 3 lines in PowerShell. So you can choose on them. PowerShell is obviously the recommended approach, but depending on how rebellious you're feeling, you might go for the one-liner. But yeah, developer dashboard, awesome. Right, so what we've done is we've gone through and we've looked at WSM solutions, okay? We've looked at common attributes, and we've looked at some of the new features and how that actually fits into these common attributes. So I hope that's kind of been useful just to sort of show you kind of the range of things that have been enhanced. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to go through and sort of look at how we can put this into practice. This is obviously, a lot of the stuff is kind of theoretical, but we're just going to go through and look at some of those different steps that we're going to go through in the application lifecycle using a demo. So we're using an example scenario at least. Yeah. Right, MyFace, okay? This is the social networking site for people who want to log on and make a comment about your face. Okay. Basically what the idea is here, just trying to look at, in this example scenario, we've got authenticated users who want to, edit their profile. They want to log in, they want to upload a new photo or something. But then you also want to have anonymous users browsing the site, and they want to be making comments. That's the whole point of the site, right? They want to be making comments about your face. And of course, when we do that, we're going to want to use content deployment because content deployment's awesome. And so we're going to work out, how we can actually put that together. So when you're sort of looking at the sort of standard stages of your application lifecycle, we've got our requirements, okay? A little bit high level, but I think we can work with that. We've only got an hour. The next thing we need to do is we need to go through a design. So now we're going to spend a little bit of time just looking at the design of a solution and thinking about maybe some of the things that we need to be able to take account of going from 2007 to 2010. Then we're going to go through looking at some of the things, the changes and how you can implement some stuff, and then finally look at some of the sort of changes that have happened around your deployment packaging from initial and incremental. Right, so at Provoke, we have sort of a particular design process that we go through, and it's really because we kind of really focus on the user experience side of things. So we have a design process that has to take that kind of UCD, or user-centered design, and then kind of SharePoint design and put it all together. Okay, so some of the artifacts that we kind of produce probably aren't necessarily going to be what you guys are going to be using, but there are 3 particular design artifacts that I would suggest are probably pretty important that you're going to need to be capturing. So assuming you've probably got your own kind of versions of these, but I'm just going to go through those. And basically what that boils down to is making sure that you understand what you're doing from a wireframes perspective, from the content type perspective, and from the site structure perspective. Okay. So first up, we're looking at, essentially what we need for our wireframes. And the wireframes are really around making sure that we know what content is going on the pages. How it's going to be branded and all that, but it doesn't have to be, we don't have to have a full-on Photoshop or anything. It's really just about knowing what's on there. And at that point, we can work out, is this going to be a web part? Is this going to be a zone? Is this going to be a field control? What is it going to be? Is it going to be a custom control? And as a result of that, once you've kind of, created these wireframes, you can go through and extract every single component and know what you're going to do to create it. Are you going to use a content query web part? Cool, that's great. Is there a particular situation that means that you can't use the content query web part or one of the other out-of-the-box web parts? That's cool. We can document it and say, why are we using this custom one? Which is, pretty important when it comes down the line when somebody else has got to maintain it and someone starts complaining about, why you didn't use this out-of-the-box control. You need to know why you're making the decisions you're making. Now, in 2007, a lot of these kind of decisions around your wireframes and working out what you were going to be putting on these page layouts was sort of boiling down to, do you want to have a custom web part or do you want to have like a custom field control? All the out-of-the-box ones. And some of the considerations that you have around that would be that sort of the dynamic nature. So if it's a web part that needs to draw up based on some other criteria, maybe something that's specific to the page, then, that's going to maybe tend towards using a web part. And also, from a web parts perspective, you want to know how you're going to maintain it going forward. If you've got a single web part that you can update, a custom web part with some code running in the background and, user control on the 12 hive, then you could just update that and it would immediately be available everywhere. Versus maybe if you've done it, on page layouts and you've got maybe specifically in web part zone and pages, then, there's a couple of issues around there. But these are the sort of the main things that you'd be worried about. Now, on the flip side, like the reasons why you wouldn't want to use these web parts is predominantly around versioning. So you'd have your web part zones, and that's cool. You can style the stuff up, but the next time you make an edit to it, it's like boom, like suddenly like that's replaced. Like you don't have a version history for your web parts. So that would mean that maybe we should be doing custom field controls for these things. A little bit more work, perhaps, but ultimately it means that you've got that maintainability, which is really great. Within the 2010 context, now, as we're sort of seeing with the content query web part, it sort of takes care of a couple of these things. Okay, so suddenly that kind of dynamic aggregation, maybe not so important now. Maybe we could just use an out-of-the-box one now on the page layout, not on a zone. It's a little bit more maintainable. We can centralize it in one place and then upgrade it if we need to. And one of the great things about 2010 web part zones is that you now have versioning of your web parts. So if you go in there and you start tweaking the properties of your web parts, as long as you're using like actual check-in, check-out, you have to be using that, okay? You can't just go edit page. You've got to use your version control, check-in, check-out for the page. As long as you do that, you can actually go back and revert to a previous version of that page containing all the properties of those web parts at the time. So it's a little bit, the user interface is a little bit confusing because you go through, and I don't know if you guys have seen in 2010, there's like a new fandangled way of comparing different versions of a page and that, which is pretty awesome, but unfortunately it doesn't include any of the web part information. And it gives you a little helpful message saying that it's not going to include the web part properties. But then if you actually do revert it back, then it does have the web part properties that you had there. And that works either in a web part zone as well as in a wiki field. So if you've got a wiki field, put a web part zone in there. So just a couple of considerations that you might want to sort of just take note of going forward. It affects the way that you're going to sort of be choosing about whether to use field control, web part, that kind of stuff. Now, content types. I think content types are like one of the most fundamental parts of a SharePoint solution, because the way that you actually design the content types, the way that you where you specify your different site columns, that's going to have a massive effect on the way that you maintain the site. Going forward, some things are going to be really easy. Some things are going to be a real pain. So you need to make sure that you've designed how your content types are going to fit together with that kind of the upgradability in mind. Now, within 2007, we had, when we're designing our content types, the main thing is that, firstly, the content types that we define are going to exist within a single site collection. Okay, so we're limited to that part of the hierarchy, and yeah, so basically we needed to sort of spec that out with that sort of mindset. And another thing about, once we understand what content types we've got, we'd also want to work out what page layouts match or are associated with which content types. And that was really important because when you were trying to change the page layout that a page used, so if a user has created a new page based on a page layout, suddenly they decide that they want to use another page layout, in 2007, that was really easy to do if both of those page layouts were both associated with the same content type. Okay, you just go into page settings, those are your options. Anything associated with the same associated content type. So these things are really important. Now, within 2010, so from the sort of the structural perspective, suddenly we've got content types that don't actually need to be defined within the site collection. Okay, maybe they've come from an enterprise content type hub. Maybe they come from somewhere else, and you need to think about, why are you putting the content type here? Why isn't it an enterprise content type hub? Is it going to be used in other site collections? Is it specific to this particular solution? There's no true or false or right or wrong answer there. You need to think about it and make sure that on your documentation, at least, you know where it's coming from, because you don't want to go back and have to rework stuff later. The other thing is, from this example, we're looking at the comments. So comment up here on the left, that was the reason it's pink. It's not necessarily because I like pink, it's just that sort of drawing that out, saying, that could have been used with an enterprise content type hub, okay? So maybe comment is something that we do want to reuse. So instead of just putting it there, maybe we want to say, actually, it's not coming from there, it's coming from this enterprise content type. How are we going to document that out? The BCS, obviously, as well, gives us the ability to define content that is outside of the site collection. And so the reason that I've highlighted the external and face comment there is that face comment in this situation or this scenario, we're going to implement that using an external content type. So again, we're going to put it on the content type map because it kind of is a content type, but we're still going to map it there, but make sure that it's clear that it's not actually existing within the site collection. And the other thing around the page layouts there is that here, for our scenario, we're creating this face page layout. We've created a new face content type that inherits from the article page. And, for this situation, it makes sense for the face page layout to be associated with the face content type. But there are situations where possibly you don't need to worry so much about defining page layouts right down to individual content types, depending on where your site columns are available and that kind of thing. But the point is that it's a lot easier to switch pages between page layouts now. So, now you basically just have, instead of having to go through the page settings and all that, in the ribbon, you've now got the ability to be able to select, the page layout and choose from, a whole bunch of different page layouts, even page layouts that don't have the same associated content type. So, there's kind of a few changes in the way that you're going to be designing those content types going forward. Now, another thing that we use, this is the SharePoint sitemap. So we kind of refer to it internally, at least, as the spite map. Maybe for you guys, depending on how well the project is going, you may also call it the shite map. But either way, it's the SharePoint sitemap. So we're taking what the IA guys have come up with, and we're really working out how we're going to implement this using SharePoint, okay? Because at the end of the day, we don't have subpages, okay? Flipping IA people keep coming up with these subpages. It's it's not going to work, Well, you're going to need a web. You're going to need a web pages library, and it's got pages. And if you need subpages, you need to create another web, and then that's got to have pages underneath it. So the thing here to sort of think about is how you're actually structuring that, and you need to work out, what webs you've got, what lists and libraries, where they're going to sit, all that kind of thing. Now, within 2007, going back to our MyFace scenario, it's pretty likely, I'm just being pragmatic, it's pretty likely that somewhere along those requirement stage, someone's going to stand up and say, actually, no, we're not going to use content deployment, we're going to push back. You need to be using, extended web applications. You need to have two different zones. One of them's going to be for your authenticated users, one of them's going to be for anonymous users. Maybe you try and work around it and do this big solution with web services and all the rest, but unless somebody's paying for it, a lot of the time you're just going to go for the extended web applications, these multiple zones. So that's kind of what we would do in 2007. Whereas now we're in 2010, we do have some other options here, okay? So, actually, I'll just go back there for a sec. The other thing to notice there is that the comments list, we're using a single comments list because obviously, we've got everybody, whether they're anonymous or authenticated, they're all using the same comments list because there's no problems, content deployment, all the rest. When we go into 2010 and we start thinking about using content deployment across, we need to be able to identify particular areas that actually cannot live within that site collection. because anything that, we've got this read-only site, anything that needs to be edited on a read-only site can't live in the site. I mean, it's kind of straightforward. And so an example of a way that we could solve this whole my face scenario would be doing something along the lines of this. Okay, so we've got a single site collection at the source that gets content deployed across to the destination. We have our pages library, and we have a bunch of these face profile pages. And then we also have our comments list, which is used, with maybe approval on it and that kind of stuff, and that can be used for surfacing up the comments that are relevant to a particular face. But we've also got this external comments list. And what we can do is that on the destination site, if you want to post back comments, post them to the external list. Okay? At that point, we can use the BCS to do what we want to do with it. And if we actually do want to store it in a database, that's cool. In this scenario, and not necessarily that this is always going to be suitable, but in this scenario, what we've done is we're using the external comments list to route it back into the comments list in the source site. So, that's going to work if it's all in the same farm, and if you don't have any other particularly philosophical problems with it. But, it removes you don't have to make that decision up front. All you need to know about is the fact that you've got that BCS, you've got the list, you've got the external list, you've got the comments list, and that's kind of a potential way that we can actually structure that. So this is the part in the demo when I go through a couple of code examples. Now, my laptop would have loved to have been here this morning with you all, and I sure would have loved it to be here as well. Unfortunately, I think it had a little bit too much fun at Tech Fiesta last night, and he's not going to be joining us. But I thought I'd turn this into another demo. Well, not really a demo, but a sort of a little tip for you. When you're dealing with SharePoint, one of the things you're going to learn is you've always got to have a DR strategy, right? Or it's at least a good idea to have DR strategy. And one of the common patterns that you're going to use with DR and SharePoint is that you're going to have a read-only content of your copy that's available. So a read-only copy of all that content that's going to be available. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to my read-only content copy of my demo. Basically screenshots, yeah, anyway. Awesome. Okay, so I've taken screenshots of this whole thing. Not much I can do, right, but hopefully you'll get the gist anyway, okay? So this is my face. I'm available for logo design as well, if you're particularly interested. Yeah, so it's a social network, people who want to log on and make a comment about a face. So on the side there, we've got our recently added faces down the left here. Well, actually, you're right, yeah, you're right. And over there, we've got our logo, and on the other side, just got a little bit of simple navigation. We can browse through to a face profile page. Thanks, Steve. So, example of face profile page here that we could browse to. We can also go into edit mode for a particular face page. There's actually a picture of our CEO. If you knew him about 50 years ago, you might recognize him from this photo. Sorry, mate. Anyway. And you can also see there that we've got so we've got our person name field just at the top there. And so the way that the solution is working is that we've got a field control with a site column, and all we're doing is we're specifying that person name there, and then we're tying that together to the comments list because each comment ties back to an individual person name. Okay? So what we can do is we can browse through to the comments list now. And the comments list, this is basically where all the comments that we're going to associate with particular users are going to be. Now, we're not going to expect the end user to go through this, but this is kind of what it's going to look like if you browse through it and kind of look under the hood. We can create a new comment. So here, just from a sort of a administrative perspective, create a new comment for Bill. Put the title as Bill because it's for Bill. I'm giving him his message. Can you guys read that, or shall I be? No? Okay. So what we've got is we've got our page layouts. We've got a face page layout. We've got our comments list, and we're tying the comments back to a person's page based on the site column of the person name. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to put a content query web part onto the face page layout that brings back the comments associated with that face. Again, okay, so this is something that in the past we would have had to either put an individual content query web part on every single face page and specify it uniquely, or we probably would have had to do some sort of custom code to handle. So firing up SharePoint Designer here, We're going to go through, look at our page layouts, and we're going to check out the face page, okay? Just the face page layout that we're actually looking at here. Go through and edit it. Just wait a little bit, just to make it a little bit more realistic. Cool, sweet. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so now we're in SharePoint Designer, and we've got this sort of split view. Generally, I'm going to get rid of that split view, just go straight to the code, straight to the good stuff. And in here, we've got a couple of little placeholders. So we've got a placeholder to just show us, the comments that have actually been already given for this particular user. And we've also got, a place where we can put in a new web part to add a new comment for that user. So we're just going to highlight over the first part where the comments are. And we're going to go up and insert a new web part. Okay. So insert a new web part, go down, choose Content Query Web Part. Okay, boom, it's in there now. So we can right-click on that and go down to the tag properties. Tag properties is going to bring up Content Query Web Part properties. And we're going to go through into the query node. Okay, so we're going to expand out the query node. And what we're going to say is we want to bring back items from the comments list. So we'll browse, seeing all the lists and the webs that are available here at the moment. And we're going to say the comments list, so we'll just select that. That's going to come in there now. So we can OK it. Okay, so once we hit OK, we're going to go back and we're going to go and have a look at Bill's face page. Okay, and we can see that all of the comments have been drawn back. Okay, so we've got we've got a comment for Steve, we've got a comment for Bill. Actually added another comment there that you guys didn't see, but anyway. And this is what we'd get to in 2007. Okay, so we're getting all the comments back because we've wired it up to the comments list. Not ideal though. So what we can do is we can, obviously we look at Bill's as well, Bill and Steve, and both of them got the same comments. Now what we can do is we can go back into the Content Query Web Part tag properties. Okay, we scroll down, so we open up the query tab, or the query node. We scroll down into the additional page filters, or the additional filters. And from here you can see what I'm doing is, instead of saying, no filter, I'm saying I want to draw back content where the title of that content is equal to, and you can see we've got a little, I don't know if you guys can read that, but it's basically it's like a square bracket, page field value, colon, person name. So person name is the name of the site column that we're using. Close square bracket. So and that's basically just a little a tag that's basically going to get substituted in the query. So when the Content Query Web Part renders, or when it's instantiated, it's going to go through and it's going to construct the query based on the substitution of the person name from this current page, putting it into the query, and then getting the results and firing them to the XSLT. So as soon as we OK that and go back to Bill, now we can see that it's actually only showing Bill's comments, which is ideal. So pretty straightforward, right? Well, it's pretty nice. And we go to Steve, and Steve has his comment. So that's cool, but at the moment, what it's rendering is Steve or Bill, and that's not the comment, is it? It's just the title. And the reason is that the XSLT, or the style that we've used in the Content Query Web Part, is using the title field to render this thing out. But what we want to do is we want it to render that comment field out. Now, in 2007, we would have had to go through and, camel view fields, all that kind of stuff, internal name, blah, blah, blah. But now in 2010, what we can do is we can go back into SharePoint Designer. I like this screenshot because it's real realistic as well. It's just another way to go through, and this time we go into the Presentation tab, Presentation node. Open that up, and we'll scroll down a little bit. And you can see under here where you select the styles. Okay, in 2007, you'd normally go through and select the style, the template that you want to use to render these things out. But now underneath that, we've got these slots under it's called Fields to Display here. Okay, and so all we need to do is we need to go down to that title slot and put the name of the site column that we want to use to pass through the XSLT to render where it would be rendering its title. And here all we need to do is just say message. Okay, we can save that, go through, check it in. Now I can go back, and now the comment, instead of saying Bill, which was the title of that comment item, it's now saying Hey Bill, which was the message associated with that comment item. So that's all for the first little demo. Got another one, but you can see straight away like how simple it is just to sort of wire that up and get it working. Now the second demo that I've got here is around the visual web part. So obviously the next part of it, now that we've got we've got comments coming back for the current user. We also want the ability for an anonymous user to be able to add a new comment. So back to our face page layout. We're going to go through and we're going to fire up Visual Studio. So good times. At this point, we're going to go through, create a new project, and we're I would generally recommend just basing on the empty SharePoint project. I mean, we know we're going to create a web part, but at least when you do it this way, you've got a little bit more. It's a little bit easier to make sure the names are all kind of nice and everything. You don't have to go through and rename stuff. Just create it with the right name to start with. So create our empty SharePoint project. Click OK. Now, at this point, we need to choose around whether we're going to deploy it as a sandbox solution or a farm solution. With the visual web part, because it deploys straight into the SharePoint root, or the 14 Hive, or the 12, whatever, the new version of that, deploys straight into the file system, it needs to be a farm solution. Okay, so there are other tools that you can use that allow you to sort of, create a visual web part as a sandbox solution, but in this case, we need to say it's a farm solution. Going to go through, add that. Cool, visual web part. Okay, so now we get our user control hosted inside the visual web part. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to add, some user interface to it. All we're going to do is we're going to add, a text box so they can add their comment and button. That's pretty much it. And a little message that, once they've submitted it, pop up the little message. Code behind. So now we go back into code behind of our user control, and we can, in page load, we can basically just add an event handler, an on-click for that button that we've added. Okay. So we're just going to say, when this button is clicked, do this stuff. First thing we're going to do is, because we know that the people who are going to be submitting comments are anonymous users, we're going to want to elevate it up so that they can actually add that item to the list. Okay, so we're going to add it directly into the external list. So we're going to wrap that in with an anonymous method, SP security, run with the elevated privileges, probably familiar with that one. Inside that, we're going to open up a new site. And obviously the reason for that is that anything that we use with the context, the SP context, even if it's within SP security, run with elevated privileges block, if you use SP context, it's still going to use the context that the user's actually in. So you need to actually open up a new site and use that for your context. And all we're going to do is just pass in the ID of the context site to create a new site. Going to go through, and now all we're doing, straightforward, 101 SharePoint dev stuff. We're just going to create a new item in the external comments list, update some properties, and then display our final message. So you can see when we're using the BCS, it abstracts away all the stuff. We don't need to know where it's going. We just treat it like a list, add that comment, and it's going to do what the BCS model has defined for it to do. So at this point, you can deploy it. And we can go back into SharePoint Designer, open up our page layout, go through, and basically we can just go through, insert new web part. We've got this cool little selector. We've got autocomplete, so you can start typing it, and it will filter it right down there. Select the web part that you've just created, and it will add in. Check it back in. Now back to our site, and we can go through, and now we've got this little add comment web part, little visual web part. And from here we can add our message in, another message, edit. It's going to say thanks for your face feedback. If you're using a Connect Query web part, at this point it might take a little while to come through. Connect Query web part uses the portal sitemap provider for cached results for queries, and sometimes it can take a little bit of time to come through. So the other way you can do it is you can edit the tag properties of the Connect Query web part and just say use cache equals false, and it'll come through immediately. Okay, just a little debugging thing there. But once it's come through, our comment's going to be there, and it's all good. So what's happened? So what's happened is we've used the Content Query web part to roll up comments from the comments list that are related to the current user, and we've created a visual web part to add a new comment to an external list so that it goes back into the source site and then comes through the comment list and gets presented to the user again. So this is it's an example way that you could potentially structure a site so that you can sort of get around some of these things around content deployment, as well as having some social data on it as well. Right. Cool. So that's the DR demo that we'll go through. So what have we done? So You guys have been awesome, okay? So we've gone through, we've looked at WCM, we've looked at new stuff, looked at common attributes, looked at how SharePoint 2010 takes all these common attributes and makes them more awesome. Then we've looked at how we can actually put this into practice, okay? So the first thing we looked at how we're going to design our sites a little bit different. Then we've looked at some of the ways that we maybe want to be able to build our sites a little bit different. And now what we're going to look at is we're going to look at a little bit around deployment, okay? Now, deployment, it's one of these things, right? So in deployment, this slide is really around incremental, well, initial and incremental. And I think that a lot of time people focus a lot on that initial deployment. So, you create a WSP, obviously, to create that initial deployment. But you always need to make sure you know how you actually can upgrade the site once you've got it in there. So there's a bunch of options. So some of the options, we've got here, we could use code. We could build the entire thing through the object model. Okay, not particularly productive, but we could do it. And it would also satisfy our need to be able to upgrade content as well, because we can make a tweak to the code and run it, whether it's in a feature receiver or just a console app or whatever. Like, it's code and it's doing the stuff, and it can basically handle all the things that we need to throw at it. Unfortunately, it's not that productive, and that's why, got an attribute there. Productive doesn't get that star, okay? Not very productive. Then we've got other options. We've got around using XML, okay? So you could go through and create full-on XML features for everything. You could create site definitions. You could do all this crazy stuff, which was awesome. But half of it didn't really work for upgrades. So, if you're wanting to use XML to update the navigation structure, some edge cases you could do it, but a lot of stuff you couldn't. XML, another example, if you're wanting to deploy a lookup list, or a list with a lookup site column to it, defining it all within content types, it's not supported within XML. You just can't do it. You've got to use some code to do some of that stuff. So there's some things that, obviously, there's some sort of problems with using that as well. Import-export is around saying, look, we could use the APIs that power content deployment to work out what's changed in the site, package that up, and then move that across, okay? And, that's pretty cool, but the problem is that doesn't really give us anything we can put in TFS. And, we want to be able to maintain all our version history. We want to be able to make sure that we've got a really good way of getting back to, if the worst should happen, we're going to be able to rebuild our site again. And then, of course, we've got SCS80 and backup restore, which, before Service Pack 2 was just basically not, in SharePoint 2007, was just not supported for, moving content between farms. After SP2, it kind of was, but, you still had to deal with a fundamental issue in that you're still going to be moving a whole bunch of developer or testing content into your production environment, and that's not a great way to be starting your production environment off. So that's kind of what we've had in 2007, a bunch of stuff, some things that are best practice and supported and not really that productive, some things that don't actually achieve what we need to be able to achieve around upgrading and just sort of incrementally deploying to our site, and some stuff that just, is just a little bit hacky, really. I mean, it's just an option, but it's not particularly great. So with 2010, we're kind of simplifying it down a little bit. Now, all those options are still there, and obviously at this stage in the life cycle of SharePoint 2010, there's some best practice that, let's be honest, maybe in a year, best practice is going to be quite different from what we're doing now. But right now, the best practice around deploying this stuff is pretty straightforward, okay? So obviously, you're going to be using WSPs for everything, okay? Everything that deploys to the file system needs to be in a WSP. And in terms of packaging and creating that WSP up, now there's a new feature within the MOS GUI that allows you to go through and export a list or a site or whatever as a WSP. Now, it's not actually available. The custom action has been removed from the publishing site def. But what you can do is you can still browse through that URL, okay? Just underscore layouts, save tmpl.aspx, and that allows you to export the whole thing as a WSP. Now, you don't want to take that and just, pass it on to, your next environment here, pass it to prod or whatever. That's not going to work. But we can use it for as a starting point. So you can import that WSP into Visual Studio. You can select the stuff that you want, so there's features and maybe these web parts, these provisioning modules, that kind of stuff. You can select what actually is important for you to have. You can make some tweaks, and then you can use that as the sort of the basis for your WSP to deploy the site. And yeah, so I really want to reiterate that you're not going to just use that straight out as it is. You're going to want to make some tweaks to it. In terms of actually once you've got that WSP, obviously that's the kind of the core, you're going to need to do that anyway. Once you actually come to deploying your initial site, okay, so that's when you first create it, in 2007, a lot of the time, there's different options, right? I mean, you could use staplers and you can use feature receivers and that kind of stuff. But, a lot of people were using site definitions, which were kind of, they kind of achieved a lot of stuff that people wanted them to achieve, but they were kind of a pain because it meant that suddenly you're kind of, you're breaking away a little bit from, especially in a publishing scenario, right? I mean, a site definition, like to me anyway, a site definition, it should be used for something that really is specific. It's a solution that's, completely, the difference between a publishing site and a team site. I mean, that's the kind of difference that I kind of see as really warranting a full-on site definition. But, people would still be kind of using that to deploy stuff. During maybe at the end of the 2007 life cycle, people started realizing that actually it's much better, much easier for you to use staplers, so feature staplers and feature receivers and that kind of stuff to be able to handle some of these things. But that was the kind of the option. In 2010, we now have these web templates. Now, if you're not familiar with web templates, then it's really important that you get familiar with them before you start deploying sites. Okay? Now, what a web template is it basically, like if you just boil it right down, it's essentially defining the delta between the publishing site definition and whatever it is that you're trying to deploy. And you can deploy that web template as part of a feature. And the awesome thing is that that is actually supported in sandbox solutions as well. So basically what that means is that you can create this new web template. Definitely going to have to use it for any kind of subwebs that you're going to be using for, within your publishing scenario. At the root web, you can use it you can use a web template, but the other option is that you can use sort of a feature that kind of configures some of that stuff up. But the web template is really the kind of the way that you're sort of being recommended at the moment to go ahead with deploying that. So ignore site defs, they're kind of, 2007, they're old school. Web templates are the way of the future, so definitely look into that. The other thing there is around is incremental updates. So again, this is something that's a little bit tricky in 2007. You needed to really work out how you were going to manage it. Within 2010, kind of simplified it a bit. Okay, so not really expected to go out and write C# to do all of your stuff and all of your updates and stuff. At this point, PowerShell is really the way to go. So a whole bunch of features there. I mean, you've got access to, obviously the object model and a whole bunch of commandlets that you can use in that as well. It's sort of expected as well that over time, as you start using PowerShell to be able to configure and provision stuff, activate features and all that kind of stuff within your sites, you're going to build up a little bit of some scripts and that kind of thing, and you're probably going to be maintaining them in a similar-ish way to, if you think, the way that you maintain SQL scripts with updates and that kind of thing. So, it's either that or if you want to spend the time and merge it all back into sort of one master PowerShell script that creates the site and does all increments it and all that kind of thing based on the initial WSP. You could do that as well. But PowerShell is definitely the way for incremental updates. So, what have we looked at? So, this final recap here. We've looked at web content management, common attributes in web content management. We've looked at how SharePoint 2010 extends the sort of common attributes in web content management. And then we've looked at the application lifecycle. So we've looked at how the extension of these web content management attributes actually is going to affect you when you go and actually use the stuff. Okay, we've looked at some of the ways that it's going to change your designs. We've looked at some of the ways that, you've got some new developer kind of implementation options. And we've also looked at the way that, some of the changes in the ways that you're going to be able to deploy and then, incrementally update your solutions as well. Now, final point, if I was to sum up my presentation, it's pretty much this, okay? Don't be scared of out of the box. Now, in 2007, I'm sure a lot of you guys have sort of gone through quite a bit of, it's been a bit of time in 2007. You try going with out of the box, and a lot of stuff just didn't really work out so great, So, content deployment, SharePoint Designer, VisiWiz, web part support, versioning, all this kind of stuff. It didn't really fulfill the promise, Whereas, I'm not saying that it necessarily is 100% awesome now, but it's a whole lot more awesome than it was. And so I think that it's really worth reevaluating some of the decisions that you're making and not being cynical, especially at this point in the life cycle. So don't be scared out of the box. That's it for my presentation, but you guys have been awesome. If you want to come and chat to me, if you've got any particular questions or you want to argue about something, then come and see me after the presentation. Related sessions, check them out. Thanks.